All right, it's time for another installment in our 10-part series where we're going to look at every single one of the countries that have ever been featured on this channel. And today we're looking at Germany. But before they were unified, before they were a massive powerhouse on the continent, they had to do what every other country has had to do at some point, unify. So let's look at how Germany unified in 1871. But before we do that, if you want to see more content like this, then be sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because why wouldn't you? All right, before we get into the video, one quick note. This is episode 1 of our 10-part series on Germany. As such, I'm going to be covering the history of their unification in this video, but then in part 2 I will start covering their history as a modern nation. Anyways, let's get into it. Okay, so let's start with a brief overview of Europe in the early 19th century. At this time, there was no Germany. Instead, the region was divided up into over 30 independent states, most of which were minuscule. There was Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, Hanover, Hesse, Denmark, Austria, and yes, even Rome was its own state at this time. Although many of these states were small, some were pretty large and powerful. Prussia was the largest state in the region and was actually growing in power quickly. While Austria wasn't geographically in the region, they had a lot of influence in northern Italy and held the title of the Holy Roman Emperor. The region was also home to a number of small monarchical states and free cities. Despite being independent, all of the states in the region were tied together culturally and through family ties. Many of them shared a common Germanic heritage. Their ruling houses often intermarried, and many of the states were ruled over by the same family. A prime example of this is King Frederick William III of Prussia, who was also the Duke of Saxony and the Elector of Saxony. Not only that, but Austria and Prussia both claimed the title of the Romans. In 1815, after the defeat of Napoleon, most of the German states banded together to form the German Confederation, a loose alliance of sovereign states. The purpose of the Confederation was primarily defensive, formed to protect the German states from potential French aggression. As far as governing, each state was independent and could do as it pleased. In terms of foreign policy, however, the Confederation required all member states to consult with each other before engaging in any sort of conflict. Overall, it was basically a glorified book club. Despite the failure of the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna was determined to ensure that such a figure would never come to power again. To that end, they sought to establish a balance of power between the great powers of Europe. In order to counterbalance the French, the Austrians were given control of northern Italy, while Prussia was allowed to annex some Polish territory and expand their dominance in northern Germany. With the restoration of the old regime, the great powers hoped to prevent another revolution. The Congress of Vienna worked quite well for most of Europe, but it did little to advance the interests of the German states. At this time, many Germans began to question why they were subjugated to a dying system. Some wanted to reform the Holy Roman Empire, while others argued that the time had come for a new, centralized German state. However, the majority simply wanted to maintain the status quo. After all, it worked very well for some of the larger states, namely Austria and Prussia. Why change it? But then along came Otto von Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Prussia. Bismarck was a conservative who advocated a policy called blood and iron. He believed that military power and realpolitik, or practical politics, were the only forces that mattered in international relations. Through a combination of the two, he set about uniting northern and southern Germany against a common enemy. Now, his plan was not to unite Germany under Prussian domination. Rather, he planned to unite it under his own rule as a chancellor. Either way, it's hard to argue that the man wasn't successful. So let's talk about the 3 wars that Bismarck fought in order to unify Germany. First, we have the Danish War of 1864. In 1859, a revolutionary movement broke out in the Austrian-controlled region of Schleswig-Holstein. As a result, Austria and Prussia intervened, defeating Denmark and gaining control of the region. By doing so, though, they sparked an issue. They couldn't decide how to divide it. Eventually, this dispute would lead to war, although it was really more of a territorial dispute than anything else. The war itself was short, lasting only 10 days. Prussia decisively defeated Denmark, capturing the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. According to the Treaty of Vienna, Denmark was forced to cede the territories to the victorious Prussians and Austrians. Austria originally wanted to annex Schleswig and Holstein outright, but instead they were forced to accept joint rule with Prussia. Tensions remained high between the two powers over the issue, but it would soon be forgotten when a larger conflict would break out. Next, we have the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Much like the previous war, this one also started due to a territorial dispute. Austria still insisted that they had a right to administer Schleswig-Holstein, despite the treaty explicitly stating that they were to be annexed by Prussia. Bismarck used this as an excuse to go to war against Austria. Now, despite their success in the previous war, Prussia didn't have enough military strength to take on Austria by themselves. As such, they spent the intervening 2 years preparing for war. Meanwhile, Austria refused to back down, knowing that they had the support of the other German states. In 1866, the Austrians made a fatal mistake. When the war began, they immediately declared war on Prussia's allies, including Saxony, Hanover, and Hesse, effectively starting a war on 2 fronts. The war was disastrous for the Austrians, and they would lose 80% of their army. After the humiliating defeat, the Austrians were forced to sign the Treaty of Prague, in which they ceded Venetia to Prussia. As a result of the war, they were also excluded from German affairs forever. From that point onward, Austria focused their efforts on their holdings in Asia. Finally, we have the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. By this point, Bismarck had already completed the unification of northern Germany. But the key to unifying the entire region lay with southern Germany. Unfortunately for him, they had allied themselves with France. Now, he tried everything he could to start a war with them, but they refused to take the bait. Eventually, he resorted to making an alliance with Austria. Together, they created a plan to start a war with Denmark. But once again, southern Germany refused to join them. Bismarck had to improvise. When an assassin attempted to kill the French emperor, he sent a telegram to France with a heavily edited version of the story. Thinking that the attack was orchestrated by the Prussians, the French immediately declared war. Once again, Bismarck's plan had worked perfectly. The French had taken the bait. Immediately upon declaring war, southern Germany pledged their support for Prussia. They were willing to put aside their differences to drive the French out of their territory. Over the next 2 years, the French would suffer a number of defeats at the hands of the Prussians. By the end of the war, the French had lost 100,000 men, and the Prussians had captured the French emperor. The war was humiliating for the French and would ultimately lead to the collapse of their empire. For Germany, the war was an unmitigated success. In addition to driving the French out of Germany, they had proven themselves to be a major player on the European stage. So now that they had proven themselves, the German states came together at the Palace of Versailles and proclaimed the German Empire on January 18, 1871. King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed the first German emperor, better known as Kaiser Wilhelm I. As far as borders went, the new German Empire was nearly identical to the Kingdom of Prussia. In fact, Prussia was the dominant power in the new German Empire. All the other states were essentially subordinate to the Prussian monarchy. As a result, the new German Empire was essentially a continuation of the Kingdom of Prussia, with a few extra states slapped onto it. Bismarck continued to serve under Kaiser Wilhelm as chancellor. Under his leadership, Germany would become a major power in Europe, eventually giving rise to the phrase Drang nach Osten, or drive to the east. This refers to Germany's desire to expand their territory eastward towards Russia. Ultimately, this would be a contributing factor in the start of World War I. And just like that, Germany was unified. Let me know your thoughts on Germany's unification down in the comments below. Is it something that you knew very little about, or perhaps you're a German student that's doomed to fail their upcoming test? Who knows? Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe if you want, and I'll see you in part 2.